It is almost time to start, and it's fantastic to see so many familiar names today. I've seen Ruxandra. I haven't seen you in a while, and I'm seeing a lot of students, previous students. It's really, really great to see everyone. I'm very honored to welcome you to the second discussion in our series of 5 post-COVID-19 perspectives for architecture in South Africa. My name is Hermie Delpoort, and I'm from the future STADIO School of Architecture and Spatial Design. There can be no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all of us and presented us with a new normal and all the uncertainties that come with that. The pandemic has brought into sharp focus the social, spatial, and environmental inequalities that exist in our society and in our cities, especially so in South Africa. As architects and spatial designers, we need to seize this opportunity to reinstate the importance of design thinking, not as a nice to have, but as an essential component of creating responsive and appropriate architecture. Our special skill is to translate issues and ideas into built form through the design process. How will the pandemic shape the future of urban design and architectural thinking and practices? To address this question, the School of Architecture and Spatial Design at STADIO, OpenArchitecture, and the Architectural Education Forum Africa decided to collaborate in a series of 5 online discussions. The School of Architecture and Spatial Design at STADIO is currently under construction. STADIO Holdings is an investment company in private higher education with 6 institutions and over 30,000 students. 4 of these institutions are consolidating into STADIO Higher Education Institutes, which will be launched at the end of October. The School of Architecture and Spatial Design will soon start offering short courses, and our first formal qualifications, a higher certificate and a Bachelor of Architecture, will, if all goes as planned, be launched in 2021. Our courses will be offered in a hybrid, blended way, full-time and part-time. OpenArchitecture, under the leadership of Professor Lone Paulson as Program Director, was the first SIA transformation project aligned to skills development to address the educational and structural shortcomings of the traditional full-time model of architectural education. The Cape Peninsula University of Technology was the first university to collaborate with OpenArchitecture, and the successful 6-year pilot was concluded at the end of 2019 when the part-time blended BTech in architectural technology was replaced by the advanced diploma. The program was offered online to students supported through office-based mentorship and occasional block release sessions on campus. The Architectural Education Forum Africa was founded in 2014 as the Architectural Education Forum to create a platform for architectural educators to share ideas, collaborate through research, and discuss current issues in architectural education. The Architectural Education Forum was the outcome of a symposium on architectural education hosted by the Wit School of Architecture and Planning in early 2014 under the leadership of Ariane Janse van Rensburg. The focus of the AEFA is on architectural education that is relevant for Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. This webinar series on post-COVID perspectives is focused on South Africa and is particularly on the impact of the epidemic on the urban design and architectural professions. The aim is to stimulate conversations and debate around current issues related to architectural practice and education. The conceptual idea of the 5 perspectives is therefore looking at challenges and opportunities for design thinking at 3 different scales, and how do we explore how this might impact practice and education. The 5 perspectives are perspective 1 at the scale of the city, which we looked at last week, and it was titled, How has COVID-19 impacted the city and how we address urban development? This week, we are looking at perspective 2 at the scale of the district or precinct or neighborhood, and it is addressed, it is titled, How has COVID-19 impacted urban design and how we live, work, and play? Perspective 3 Next week, we'll be at the scale of the complex and the building, and we look at how how has COVID-19 impacted how we create responsive architecture. In perspective 4, we will look at how COVID-19 has impacted the practice of architecture. And then lastly, to conclude with perspective 5, we will look at architectural education. How do we teach and learn architecture? In the framing, each of the 5 perspectives, we have invited 3 panelists with different backgrounds and experiences to present their ideas in the hope of stimulating and provoking a broader conversation. Not to find specific solutions, but rather to open up the thinking around how we might move forward progressively under the challenging circumstances that the pandemic has brought into focus. The advantage of having an online event is that we can include panelists and an audience from across the country. In doing this, we also realized what a wealth of knowledge and expertise we have in South Africa, and it was really difficult to hone in on whom to invite. We realized that we have not included many of the valuable opinions and inputs that are out there, but we have tried to include perspectives from different fields, experiences, and context. For our second perspective, this one, how has COVID-19 impacted urban design and how we live, work, and play? Our chair is Mpeti Moroyeli, and he is the owner and founder of Design Studio, an award-winning architecture and design studio based in Johannesburg. The practice has collaborated to produce some of the most iconic and culturally important projects in South Africa and continues to expand its portfolio on the continent with seminal projects in Ethiopia, Uganda, Botswana, Mozambique, Lesotho, and Burundi. Mpeti has emerged as one of the most important voices in architecture in Africa, celebrated by Arc Daily as one of the 7 architects designing a diverse future in Africa. Mpeti has lectured at the School of Architecture at WITS, the Graduate School of Architecture in UJ, and is a design critic at many of South Africa's schools of architecture. In addition, he has curated many exhibitions on African architecture, including for the South African National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in Italy and at the Royal Institute of British Architects summer season in London. Mpeti was a member of the scientific committee of the 2014 UIA Congress in Durban, and he continues to serve on many international juries, including the UIA, the European Union, the Wholesome International Foundations, to name but a few. Before I hand over to Mpeti, and I want to say thank you very much for chairing this session. Just a few house rules. Remember, please, to keep your microphones off and your videos. Not the panelists though, nor the chair. And if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We will collect the questions, and the panelists will each do a short presentation, and right at the end, there will be time for questions. And now I hand over to Mpeti and to introduce our participants and to chair the session. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this talk, which I've been given the unenviable position of trying to navigate through what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating talk from 3 eminently qualified people to do so. I will introduce each one of them, I think, in more detail before they talk. The idea is that each one will give a 10 to 15-minute presentation. After that presentation, I will then facilitate a discussion amongst themselves around the topic before we open it up to questions at the end, either to a particular member or to the panel as a whole. So first we'll start with Khalid Jacobs. Khalid Jacobs is from Jakupa Architects and Urban Designers based in Cape Town. Khalid is one of the founding directors of Jakupa Architects Urban Designers. He is past chairman of UDISA, past Secretary General of SABTACO, the South African Black Technical and Allied Organization, and is currently chairperson of SAPOA, Western Cape. Khalid's primary interest is in the humanist ideals of city making, and he has promoted notions of equity and justice through his work. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to Khalid to start the first presentation. Thanks.
Khalid, you're still on mute.
Yeah, there we go. And can I also get the share screen, please? Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So Mbet is giving me 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and I'll try my best to get through all of the stuff within the time. So while preparing for this conversation, I came across this letter that was penned by between two star architects, right? Talking about what's the architect's role in not only in COVID, but also response to all this kind of range of crises that kind of seems to be emerging globally. And you'll see that David Chipperfield said the answer is that we don't do anything as an architects. And of course, the conversation was about the role of artists and the ability to change visions of the world and actually create entirely different worlds, but whether the architect has the same ability to do the same thing. So whether we are able to preempt changes in society and the architectural response to that, or whether we're able to kind of change things retroactively. And the argument was kind of more around the fact that at our inability to change society and the global events like the pandemic. So Chikupa's response was kind of I guess what many of us have been doing. We did this painful pivot where we kind of shifted from working in the office to working at home. But we also tried to contribute to, to the plight out there by engaging in how to make masks, and how we supported a model making company that was making masks. We supported NGOs to try and kind of come to solutions on how to provide sanitary infrastructure for informal settlements. And we also kind of dabbled in how to provide emergency housing during COVID times. But those are kind of been the traditional ways in which architects kind of respond to crises, shall we say. In parallel with all of this, we've seen this very dramatic way in which people started to change how they use the city. And of course, lockdown implied we all at home, and that had an impact in terms of how many people were on the streets, reduced traffic patterns, the decentralization of how we worked and how we engaged with each other. But the question that remained in our minds was whether or not there was a spatial effect of this, where there's a lasting spatial effect of all of these kind of changes in behavior. Interestingly enough, of course, we've seen significant kind of changes based on health in how cities are made, shall we say. And the precedent that I'm referring to in particular is the Industrial Revolution and the kind of messiness of the Industrial Revolution, the filth and the disease that went with a post-industrial town. And the spatial result of that effectively was the Garden City set of ideas, and in parallel, a set of ideas promoted by Le Corbusier and his contemporaries around effectively the separation of function. So the separation of function is a solution to prevent the contamination of industry on people living in the cities. So there's spatial consequence to a set of ideas. And that spatial consequence is also reflected in Le Corbusier's iconic drawing, where he marries the urban with the rural. He brings the rural into the urban. And the rural in the urban is the representation of the idealized healthy lifestyle or healthy city that is meant to be the consequence of that move. Of course, in South Africa, we've had a very idiosyncratic response to modernism and the issue of zoning the city separately or segregating function, because we had the wherewithal to also separate race, or people living in race, and kind of a bit of a distortion of the modernist ideas. Because in fact, black people were uncivilized and they were dirty, right? It's the kind of this perceptions of separating those who are uncivilized from the civilized city. And furthermore, places like District 6 was demolished using arguments of health or the unsanitary slums that was represented by places like District 6. So it's an argument that is used to justify the apartheid planning ideals. And of course, similar kind of moves was made on other functions, like this is an image of the market on the Grand Parade, while it still existed on the Grand Parade in Cape Town. And that was, the entire market was shifted to Epping, also with the same ideas that it's going to be a cleaner and more sanitized, both physically sanitized, but also conceptually sanitizing the most important public space in Cape Town. And similarly, and thank you for Lone for finding or sharing these images with me. But there's also this kind of idea that science supports this idea of the health project or sanitizing the city through how housing is designed, particularly for what is called the natives. Right? So there's a standardized scientific rationale as to how to lay out a house and separate. And in fact, it's a house in the middle of a property, and all the rooms get a percentage of light, and sizing is good, and circulation, etc., is then scientifically argued for what is healthy. And of course, in our context at the moment, of course, is that that kind of way of thinking about suburbia and a separation of function as aligned to the goals of social distancing is largely a privilege. And what has emerged through this pandemic is really a highlighting of all the inequalities and injustices that makes our city. The bigger picture, though, is that, in other words, framing the problem, though, for me, is that it's beyond just the health crisis. Right? So the health crisis actually represents one of a series of crises that affected our country, and they go from drought, lurching from drought crisis, and the chaos that emerged from that. No energy. There's arguments around spatial justice and getting the poor into the city, and then also now, of course, this arguments around how the city responds to the COVID crisis. So I'd like to frame the problem a little bit differently, and the problem is beyond just a health crisis, right? And there are three paradigms or three bigger issues that I think needs to be brought into the conversation. The one is this challenge that we're having with the rural-urban migration, right? And the UN, through some of the studies, have predicted by 2050 more than 50% of Africa will become urban. And in fact, South Africa, which is currently about 62% urban, will be more than 80% urban by 2050, and that's hopefully still in our lifetimes. And interesting, of course, is not only the movement of people from rural to urban, it is the urban or the rural itself that is also becoming urban. So in other words, rural towns becoming urban. The second challenge, of course, is that we've got an incredibly imposing problem of employment and the ability for our population to generate an income. And obviously COVID exacerbated this problem. So in fact, while we have just under 18.5 million people that are unemployed, if you look at the people that are not economically active, you see that the vast majority of our population is in desperate and dire straits in terms of generating their own income. And thirdly, of course, is this overwhelming problem of the difference between the high income earners versus the low income earners. So the wealth gap or the income gap, we have the highest Gini coefficient in the world. Now, how that translates spatially, of course, and Professor Edgar Peters described this very well in his diagram, which is about a cycle of an inability to supply services, under supply of services, and a skewed allocation of resources, which then results in a demand on those services that outstrip that supply, and effectively, there's a cycle of slum-producing logic for how the city is organized. And spatially, there's a spatial consequence to this, right? There is a spatial consequence, and I think we've all seen this, but I just want to touch on a few readings that we all, I guess, know, and that is the spatial paradox between the wealth gaps. We have on the edges of our cities an agglomeration of the informal, where we have spaces between, or poorly managed spaces between buildings get spontaneously infilled. And very dramatically, we see the growth of informal settlements, just on the edges of urban settings. This is a settlement in Inkaneni that between 2005 and to date has mushroomed into thousands of homes. But more dramatically, of course, is over and above the rapid expansion of the settlements. There's a morphing that happens. So it's not only about, and this is Philippi on the Cape Flats, it's not only the rapid growth, but it's the rapid morphing. So from no development to informal settlement, to clearing informal settlement, building infrastructure, occupying with informal, clearing informal to put formal buildings on site, and then the reoccupation of the edges and backyarders all kind of going. So there's a dynamic there that is incredibly complex and volatile. And we worked on another project in Claremont, where this is just before last year, 2018, you can see, where we were meant to formalize the informal settlement on the edge of Claremont. And that, if you look at that circle, the area circled, we had a public meeting. We let people know about the project, and by the Monday after the weekend, there was more than 100 additional informal structures that was placed on that site. So it's not only about years that the change is happening over the weekend. Where planners have tried to manage these processes, and hopefully you can see this diagram, or the faint green lines on this diagram, that represents formal urban that was set aside for property owners, which is very different to the pattern of settlement, which kind of goes against the pattern, the settlement patterns. In parallel with all this kind of dynamics, we're sitting with a set of rules that are very sophisticated, right? And these rules are meant to kind of manage the city and how we grow, right? And they're all driven through health concerns. The standards are based on health standards. The zoning and the separation of function is all driven by health mindsets. The challenge with this set of rules is that it only applies to the formal sector of how we engage with the making of the city. And where we do get engaged with these formal processes, it takes incredibly long for it to materialize. So when you establish the problem initially at the onset, by the time you get to implementation, you're actually sitting with a very different problem. And it's not unheard of that, some developments take more than, 10 years to just get from implementation through design to site. And the consequence of this, of course, is that these processes exclude those who are not able to negotiate power, and ultimately results in an unjust city. So what we'd like to make an argument for is that making a just city coincides with making safe and healthy cities, and that these are not merely photo opportunities for the launching of projects, but that the process of making cities needs to be a lot more dynamic, right, and inclusive in that process. And we've established a set of principles that's the foundation of this presentation, which is about many hands or many authors rather than only hands, many authors developing cities over time, and through iteration, we're able to adjust the making of the city. And ultimately what will come out of this is not a single representation of what a healthy city is, but a complex one. By way of example, I presented two examples. This is a project that we're doing with CoLab, and I'm hoping Kirsty Ron is on the webinar. She's produced this with us, where there's this idea that we develop typologies that is able to accommodate growth and structure the management of cities, including health and fire safety in particular. And similarly, we were inspired by the book by Nabil Hamdi called Small Change, and Kevin Calbro's book called Making Massive Small Change, where this idea is in the context of there being very little, how does one turn a city around, right? And in this case, it's Spine Road in Kalicha, and it's a typical highway that has the backs of properties facing onto it. We were asked to implement an NMT facility, and we provided an NMT facility with additional infrastructure, which included making some defensible spaces, looking at road intersections, providing some art. But more importantly, in this project, we used the tools of being able to influence people to make change. In this case, we influenced traders to occupy the edges of the NMT facility, and also influenced the property owners to turn their backs into fronts. And if you go into Spine Road over the weekend on a Friday night or on a Sunday afternoon, it's a party. Right? So people are making the city incrementally, and ultimately this could potentially be a high street that emerges from a very small interventions. So just to kind of conclude a little bit, traditionally planning has happened in a linear process, right? And the problem with that is it takes too much time and it doesn't produce products. So we're talking about that you need to implement quickly and rapidly and reiterate. So design or the planning for projects is not a once-off master plan, but an iterative process, a continuous and everlasting process of fixing and shifting and shaping and reshaping. And that builds flexibility and adaptability, not only in the process, but in terms of how we make cities. And then to conclude, of course, is that so building healthy and just cities must be built on being nimble in how we're able to kind of quickly respond to crises, whether it be health crises or any other crisis, and incrementally manage development from one crisis to another. Thank you. Thank you, Betty. You're on mute still, Betty.
Thank you. I've been allowed to unmute. Thank you, Khalid. There's a lot of food for thought there across the kind of spectrum of dealing with this particular crisis now. I thought what was important, what was interesting from your talk, the idea that it's not like we have to get over this one crisis and it's about a health crisis, but this crises are what the future is about. And the idea that a healthy city is only one that is just, kind of linking health for all, not for some, as what constitutes a just city. So I think definitely there's a lot of interesting ideas. I'd be interested to hear in more detail as we go forward about how Cape Town has kind of taken on the idea of crisis from day zero to the current crisis. In terms of the agency of the professional, is there a change in agency? Are there considerations around changing legislative frameworks, things like that that come out of this idea of ongoing crisis? But we'll talk about those a bit further on. I'd like to then introduce the second speaker. Second speaker, Katie Ewing. Katie is a senior lecturer and convener of the Urban Design Program at UCT at the University of Cape Town. Catherine has an architectural urban design, planning, and research experience, working through a multidisciplinary approach in Southern Africa. She's currently non-executive director of the VPUU, and I think you'll have to give us the full explanation of that. Catherine's work focuses on the safe cities through participative design and public space, and building on lessons from design practice in various African cities. So over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Betty, and thank you very much to everybody who's facilitated this session. I'm going to share my screen now. So when I was asked to give this talk, same sort of notions of Khalid, kind of what is it that is so relevant that we need to be discussing at the moment. And I think what has come out so predominantly for me is just that notion of what was in the background has now become the foreground. And that goes through from policies, from design frameworks, from all sorts of areas that we have been looking at it. So I almost look at it as a disruption in the framing of urban design in this time of crisis. I'm trying to move my screen. There we go. So I do feel that there are two key elements that are not discussed enough, and I think Khalid mentioned it in his notion of social distancing is a privilege. So this goes to the idea of exposure and what are we exposed to in our cities? And this goes way beyond a pandemic. This goes to what are we exposed to in terms of overcrowded living conditions and the vulnerability of our citizens in our cities. And what does that mean for the unsafe neighborhoods that a lot of people live in on a day-to-day basis? This impacts access and safety. And those four elements are elements that I do feel that as a country, we need to delve into a little more. So we do know that COVID is fundamentally urban space related, and it lands squarely into our domain. So whilst we have the medics all looking at all sorts of ways of dealing with patients, we are actually within the urban space. It is spread through human movement and social interaction. And of course, this is amplified even more in our cities through the uneven distribution of resources. And what does that actually mean for our cities of the South? I think Khalid also did frame this, but this is compared, or on the other side of this, we have a climate emergency, and I call it an emergency because we are at an urgent rate of needing to look at what it is with our climate. We also have an urgency, or this rapid change, not only to a fourth industrial revolution, but the fifth industrial revolution, and what does technology mean for us? And within this, the whole idea of spatial injustice. But I always like to look at the other side of it. And I see this in two perspectives. And the first one is around, I see this as the breakdown of the walls of impossibility. So we've been doing things quite kind of steadily over the years. The notion of the framework plan and the urban design and the process of getting things done on the ground. So I do feel that there's a breakdown of this, and I do feel that it's time to actually start reimagining the publics, and that's around long-term change. So we're not designing for COVID; we're actually designing for everything that comes our way. On the other side, I do feel it's a very dynamic time to take a step back and to reset what we've been doing, and that also puts us in that idea of experimentation and innovation. And working with the agency of underground networks. So I see this as an overground framework that has been disrupted in the framing, and our underground networks, people on the ground that are guiding us to what is actually happening. So I'm going to frame my presentation today in the context of Gugulethu. So most of the work I have been involved in over the last 10 years is in the south of Gugulethu, but more recently in 2020, taking it beyond and to the north. So this is kind of a reflection and very much thoughts and process based in Gugulethu as a context. So the first space I'm going to take us to is this idea of the space of practice. And this is based over the design and research that I've worked in with BPUU, so that's violence prevention through urban upgrading, over 10 years within Gugulethu. So back in 2010, we started working in an informal settlement called Lotus Park, informal settlement. And over the years, taking us through a process of highlighting a particular precinct. Now, when I talk about precinct, I talk about it in a notion of land that was available and land that was ready to be changed. So starting off with quite a transformation project, which which built a neighborhood center. And then as funding sort of came about and community needs were on the table, the idea of a sports court. The sports court was in use so much, we needed to get some lights in, so putting some lights in, through to then working in partnership with the Mandla Edu Football, developing in 2017, the Oliver Kahn Safety Hub and Youth Center on the other side of the road. And then 2018, building an early childhood development center that then was activated in 2019, and more recently, a waste recycling center. So I think this goes to that idea of time and what does time mean in terms of kind of development of projects. But I think key to this is this idea of resilience. What does this project actually do to improve the quality of life of the residents of Lotus Park? So I always like to see this in context, and you can see Lotus Park in the background and the Mandla Edu Football Safety Hub to the left. But this is a context where it has a microeconomy, and the microeconomy is not something that we engage in enough, and I'll come to that a little bit later. So I take 3 frames from this, just to kind of land that spaces of practice. And how do we design in a time of uncertainty? In other words, how do we design beyond COVID? How do we design for resilience that allows an area or a neighborhood to continue functioning even through something like a pandemic? Or are we talking about a fire or flood or just daily crime that we have to deal with? So I see it as three frames. The first one is about productive partnerships. So definitely rethinking the methodology of the how. How do we actually start doing this? And partnerships goes beyond working with kind of formal partners. It's actually multiple partners, and that goes through to local government, that goes through to community representatives, and also other NGOs. So a multitude of partners and co-producing and co-designing. The next, I do feel that it's a reframing of the term informal settlements. The minute we start labeling areas as such, we're into that realm of legality. So I put it in the notion of safe neighborhoods and implementing an area-based approach, which was very much from the BPU approach. And then the next one I look at, especially in times of crisis, is this idea of active frameworks. So frameworks that are never static. And how do we craft this public realm as transformative and one that is safe? So an active framework, it never stops. And for too long, we have seen these frameworks as in their individual silos. So that leads me to my next space, which is spaces of exchange. And this is kind of my question to myself of where should we be landing our focus in the COVID-19 landscape? And the first space of exchange I look at is this is education. So for me, this is about reviving the focus of the community in the neighborhood. So early childhood development is your foundations for life. And I do feel that these are also our first port of calls in a COVID landscape. So where can children feel safe, and where do they have the ability to be looked after and cared for? So that idea of a city that cares. So if one mapped all the ECDs in Gugulethu, you can start creating a network, and a network is so much more powerful. So when you're in the collective versus the individual. But I do feel that the ECDs are places that we have disregarded in the past, and they are potentially our biggest asset at the moment. The next one I'm going to look at is food security. And this places itself in the idea of urban gardens. And I have a student at the moment who's working on this work, and this takes reference from her, from Alma Ruse. So I do feel it's about the shifting the idea of the production of land, and it's about supporting the micro industries. But this goes from right down from the scales to the smaller, more community gardens, to rethinking what are our water networks, why are they not productive, and then also tapping into currently an unused railway line. So one could question what the railway line is actually doing through Gugulethu at the moment, other than being a barrier. So how can we actually start changing these and making them productive? The third frame I will look at in this is this idea of livelihood and the desperate need for creating a livelihood in areas where resources are scarce from government institutions. So it's building on local knowledge, but at the same time, we can start deeply questioning the role of housing into that idea of live, work, play. And with that comes this idea of a radical change in rezoning. So where rezoning does not stop what we're actually doing in terms of what that means. Is it creating spaces along highway on main activity routes that you can have a jazz, you can have furniture manufacturing, and what is it where the spaza can actually be your hub, where you can it can be a collection hub, it can you can come and go from that spaza shop. It is your port of call for your communication, not only for you to buy food, but other mechanisms that the spaza can actually be so much more in a community than we currently plan around that. So some of this mapping comes from the student work that I've been working with this year. Some of the mapping comes from work over the years with VBUU, and then some of the work comes from student work where they did interviews and quite intimate mapping in Gugulethu, and actually understanding the diversity of livelihood and what that actually that the benefit of that is. So I'm gonna leave this in the third space, which is a space of learning, where I see that there's immense benefit in agency beyond the academy right now. And this was a studio we ran in 2020, at the beginning of 2020, a week before lockdown. So I have this constantly as my record for what this actually, the value in this form of co-design actually means. It's interdisciplinary. It crosses vertically and horizontally across studios. But more importantly, we had members from Gugulethu community and sharing and coming to the university youth from Gugulethu. So we conducted a series of what we call Gugulethu walks and also had a series of Gugulethu talks, which hopefully we're going to take into a mode of being a collection, foundation of library and information that we can take forward into and allow this information to be more open source and accessible, where that information will then start informing other active frameworks. But this year certainly has put us on pause and into this idea of sort of play and then pause and then stop and then replay. And I do bring in, and I know this is a discussion in a later perspective, but I do feel that that idea of teaching beyond the academy in an online world is something that we are grappling with. But I do find it incredibly exciting, especially in our South African context, where we can land off grid. We can actually explore the inventiveness of what is on is in our own cities. But this also means a definite shift in the curriculum and how we actually are teaching. And then what are we extracting and working with? And then how are we crafting and applying urban design into practice that actually is around transforming urban place and placemaking. Coming back to the project, the VPU project at the beginning, and that opportunity of turning things on its head, and often not having to kind of follow certain kind of stringent guidelines, is almost that opportunity of inventiveness that is needed in the current time of COVID. And that's all.
Hi. Okay, thank you, Katie. So we started with from Khalid, the idea that a just city is a healthy city and a healthy city is a just one. Katie is talking about the safe city and how we design for vulnerabilities through a kind of a bottom-up approach, which I think a lot of her work, especially with VPU, I almost said VPS, has kind of highlighted, and the idea that a lot of what has been in the background is now being foregrounded. I would be interested to see, I mean, the violence prevention through urban upgrading kind of looked at how you prevent violence through social coming together. In other words, by developing places, eyes on the street, by developing places where people congregate in order to make spaces, public spaces, safer. But if safety now has to deal with health issues that require distancing, then it adds another dimension to that process, which maybe we can talk about a bit further. So yeah, that's very interesting. Let's go on to the third person, and then we can see how we can cross-pollinate the different concerns. Solam Mkabela. Born in Swaziland, Solam holds a BAS in architecture and a master's in city planning and urban design from UCT. Educated at Waterford Kamhlaba UWC School in Swaziland, Massachusetts College of Art in Boston, and at the Cooper Union in New York, where he worked for the renowned urbanist Michael Sorkin from 1992 to 1996. Upon his return to South Africa, he was a presenter on the youth radio station YFM, and he worked on the productions of film as well. Solam is currently a lecturer at the University of Wits School of Architecture and Planning. He's in the process of completing his PhD on urban scripting, the inclusion of audiovisual storytelling in the urban design process. Thank you. Over to you, Solam.
Hi. Sorry, yeah, thanks, Mpeti. I'm just going to share. Is it full screen? Hello?
Yes,
Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks to Lone et al. For making contact. Thanks to Mpeti for chairing, Khalid for the spatial justice, and Catherine for the frame. Imagining as a need in South African cities, whose story to tell? How has COVID-19 impacted urban design and how we live, work, and play? Basically, urban design concerns shaping settings for life in villages, towns, and cities. COVID-19 crisscrosses the pedagogy and epistemology of urban design. In other words, both establish conditions for living, working, playing, and the design of the distance. Catherine framed the intersection between urban design and COVID-19. The global pandemic inspired a relook at how the first urban design studio at the Wits School of Architecture and Planning would run. Because of COVID-19, the studio's mandate was, due to current times of uncertainty and the country's lockdown, schedules might be amended, deliverables restructured in response to university directives and from the president of the country. We are all new to this situation and learning. There will be unseen challenges, and we need to find unconventional solutions. What I'll share with you this afternoon is a response to that particular theme, and then leave basically the people here with 3 questions. How has COVID-19 impacted urban design and how we live, work, and play? COVID-19 structured the brief of a 6-week urban design studio. We explored with the following themes. So, city inside out, my story is yours too, I height, and new distances. The brief stated that the design of space, especially in emerging democracies such as South Africa, is premised with political agendas. These agendas can range from progressive and utopian to repressive and unjust. As spatial makers, our obligation is to be mindful of the relationship between space and political agendas. The studio aimed to explore ways in which critical thinking and considered design can facilitate particular positions. This is what Khalid referred to as, I suppose, a spatial consequence in the first presentation. As an objective, the Accessible City Studio aimed to introduce the concept of the right to the city regarding access, ownership, and belonging through various ways of reading and writing. This was the premise that in the process of developing relevant urban frameworks, understanding the local context is the most significant. Catherine alluded this to basically the process of engaging local knowledge. The question explored in the studio was, in the city of multiplicity, how do we engage to understand? My research basically extends that and goes to how do we communicate the understanding to wider audiences? What Khalid commented as the remaking of spatial reality. So in formulating a methodology, my research turns to Matsipa, who argues that research should seek to explore and promote the agency of marginalized urban actors, with particular attention to limited I'm going to struggle with this word, conceptualizations, Singis, of globalization imposed upon the ability of architects to read the city, its spaces, and together with other urban actors and residents to craft an alternative paradigm for ongoing development. So the studio's proposal plucked from numerous ways of reading the city, such as the one mentioned by Khalid in the first presentation. But we looked at looking at the city inside out, or sort of similar to Catherine's concept of foreground, background. In order to address the complex spectrum of South African urban realities of mitigating the gap between top-down and bottom-up thinking procedures, of claims to the city, and of distances between citizens, of access to social and economic means, access to information and its packaging, the studio addressed access from three layers. That was theory, methods, and production, with a strong focus on visual narratives as a form of urban practice. The task was to write a short story and translate it into a graphic sequence involving you as protagonist, your current physical distance to things and social networks as a window to the outside world. Lockdown, self-isolation, quarantine forced us to abandon the idea of exploring the city and physical engagement with people outside of our immediate domestic context. As a result, a shift of attention was placed to the interior that we were forced to retreat to take a journey around our respective rooms, to ultimately meet ourselves in newly defined distances and explore limits of access. So exploration could be literal, metaphorical, allegorical, political, or whatever lens initially chosen to examine the current situation. This would be an opportunity to take ownership of a situation of which you may feel out of control, such as, feelings of isolation, feelings of boredom, fear, new and different habits, discoveries, routines, moments of joys, different ways to meet other people. The inclusion of visual storytelling processes as forms of site assessments aims at expanding the urban design discourse by rendering visible what at times seems invisible to the powers of the state, to see what the reality of the city, to see what is, what can be, and to make research outcomes accessible to a wider audience. So in a nutshell, the approach is about understanding urban complexity through the way we see what we see, inside out, outside in. Okay, so as conclusion, I'll return to the topic of imagining. So COVID-19 has re-highlighted the gap between the have and the have-not, between rich and poor, served and serving, inside and outside, foreground and background. In exploring this gap, I turn to Richard Pitzau's post relating to the Turwood, a new building in Rosebank, as preparation to my three questions. So Richard says it's a building for the very rich in Rosebank, and from the street you confront three stories of concrete and wire before the windows of the flats begin way above the street, too high, of course, for them to appear as any sort of opening. The physical scale of this exclusion dwarfs any prison wall that I've seen, but the sensation of passing does remind me of passing the old prison in Durban as a child. The building's material is a material of expression of deeply anti-democratic spirit. It feels like an early expression of the feudalism of the future. It is also by any measure a shit show in aesthetic terms, but yeah, that's another matter. So the question is that I leave to you in making Khalid's, the just city. What measures may the practice adopt in mitigating the extreme inequality plaguing our cities? How do we, as a profession, remain relevant? Who do we serve? In other words, whose story do we tell? Whose story do we prepare the city to support and unfold? Mpeti, I think I'll leave it there, and then we can maybe have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Solam. Another presentation which I would like to call the surveilled city. It's about whose gaze on the city and what are we looking at, as you have said. This idea of surveillance, which has become quite a hot topic in trying to manage the pandemic. The kind of tracking and tracing that we've seen in other cities. And the kind of questions around privacy and being notifiable, with a notifiable disease where you have to notify your movements, where your movements are surveyed, you're being tracked, and all the questions around who's gazing at who and what we consider normative behavior in looking at each other. And the idea of storytelling, that we can look at the same kind of behaviors and tell a different story about them, depending on our kind of ideological space, the kind of political agenda that you talked about. So I think that's a nice way to kind of round up some of the concerns that are coming out of, particularly out of this crisis. As we say, we should never waste a crisis, and you should always try and look for positive outcomes out of it. But as sometimes happens, you also get extremely negative outcomes that come out of particular crises. So I'm maybe interested to hear from all of you. If you look at the healthy city, the just city, the safe city that Catherine talked about, and now the surveilled city, what are the potential positive and negative outcomes that we see coming out of how we've been dealing with the pandemic, particularly given our historical background, the kind of urbanism of South African cities? So that's a question I'd like to just frame briefly to all of the panelists. I don't know who would like to start. Maybe Solam, as you talked about this idea of surveillance, you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, Mpeti, sorry, you did come through. You started to break up towards the end. What was the question?
The question is, given that we've been looking at different aspects of how we look at the city, whether it's about health and justice or safety, whether it's about vulnerability, and what you were talking about surveillance and how we tell stories around the city. Given the pandemic that we have now, what do you think are potential positive and potential negative outcomes of the way we've been dealing with it. I'll give you an example. I came across a statistics that says 80% of suburban dwellers could work from home, and only about 5% of township dwellers were able to work from home, just because of their circumstances. Now, what does that mean for the kind of normative ways we're dealing with pandemics and public space and etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a question that within my 3 questions I asked about, whose story do we tell? So, as Salam, my position is, we have to relook at how we make cities, and not necessarily cater to the newer liberal agenda, or what I call as, sort of the corporate city. If you look at Shanghai, or you look at Dubai, this image of the city that it's, for things to be prosperous, it has to be like this particular image. So that statistic you just relayed about, the majority of people didn't have access to remote learning and working. It forces us to start thinking, I think, through the frames that Catherine started to talk about, as to where do we place the frames of focus, and who do we really design for? I think look, you can't just ignore the rich, that's not the issue here. But I think we have to start taking into consideration that the city is made up of many, many things and many people. And the people that are marginalized just also deserve a chance, a shot at it. But I think I'll let perhaps Catherine, just with the work that they've done in Cape Town through the VPUU project, is about that, about the active frameworks. Catherine, not to put you on the spot.
Squarely on the spot, but that's okay. I mean, what I've found is that, we, even 10 years ago, the working in the informal settlements were seen as kind of on the edge. And it shouldn't be on the edge. It should be squarely in the mainstream. And I think that that's what the pandemic has done for me. In some sense, it's like, it's taken what we considered radical and it's put it squarely in the middle, and we are having to address with it. So I see quite a few comments are coming through saying, like it's too big a task to take on and we need government and all that kind of thing. Well, the work that we did in Lotus Park was in partnership with government, and it was about an incremental approach, and how do you actually build on that and form a foundation that can actually create a preparedness for a time of crisis. So I never like to look at the negative, because I always feel that whatever situation we're looking at, we're in positive. I think a lot of the time we term things in the wrong way, and that actually then if we start shifting and start thinking about these things differently, like a spaza shop is actually our public space. These are our new public buildings, and then they're our new resource. And if we can spread the kind of the idea of collection and collective and agency on the ground, and work with it, I think that there is so much more that is emerging on the ground, that we as we're sitting as built environment professionals, not actually realizing and working with. So I almost want to throw the notion of zoning out the window, and the idea of the master plan, gone with the master plan. This is a city that plans together, and not a city that is planned. And those were some thoughts I had about 4 years ago as well. So I think it's kind of, how do we work with the alternatives, and what are these alternatives that we're talking about that are actually on the table? Mobility and access, like walkable neighborhoods. How can we create safe walkable neighborhoods? That should be done through many different forms. And it shouldn't even require a government to be the only ones doing that. And I think that for all too long, the urban design has relied on government to do too much. Yeah, I think that's enough from my side.
Okay, Khalid.
Very interesting, and thank you for sharing your views, guys. The one bit that I'd like to add at least is that in terms of our collective contribution to making a change during COVID, which is the current crisis, there's very little to be seen in terms of actual change. A lot of the change we see is revolving around the occupation of land and the small changes that one can see through people's own actions, individual actions. But I'm unaware of responses from the two other actors in making the city. The one is people on the ground, right? So the everyday kind of people, you and I. You also then get the developer, the property developer who makes a city, and they've got a very particular agenda to making the city, and their response has been zero. And then, of course, government, right? And government's response to making the city tended to focus on making sure that there's enough hospitals and PPE and the like. In other countries, we've seen people take advantage of empty streets to reimagine what a street needs to be. Yeah. They kind of used very simple means to reshape the organization of movement in streets, and the use of the public realm kind of changed, right? Or you can see some attempts to address the change. Our challenge is that we've been largely inactive. I'm unaware of any tangible spatial consequences of COVID, and a lot of it, in fact, we experience in normal course of doing work, and that is trying to bring innovation in the everyday planning of things. And I'm not even talking about mind-blowing innovation kind of thing in terms of cutting edge, but just simply changing the mindset of bureaucracy. It is incredibly difficult to try and engage with the people who manage rules to think differently about how to implement. So there's a lethargy of our collective responses or spatial responses, and I've seen very little consequence or spatial consequence of the COVID. So there is, and Katie also talks about it in the presentation. There's so Salam, yes, your storytelling is necessary to kind of to excite people about a new vision for what the city needs to be. You need to be able to tell the stories. And in fact, one of the primary skills of an urban designer is not to draw, but to tell a story. Maybe through drawing, but also to negotiate and convince not only the layperson, but the authorities of what you're doing is useful. So the storytelling is one thing. Building the visions that inspire people, I think, is important. And Katie's argument that our methods of building, our methods of managing the growth of a city needs to be completely rethought. And currently, those tools that we use to manage growth of the city and design the city is largely servicing half the city, and the other half of the city is left to its own devices. So the method of how one kind of think, and I think it's a massive opportunity for us to promote this idea that we can't rely on traditional methods of managing a city that was developed in in modernist times. It's a very different world that needs to be a lot more responsive and proactive in making our places. And that is not just the once-off master plan, as Katie suggests, but that planning is an active and continuous exercise solving problems. Hopefully those thoughts kind of contribute to some conversation that we can hear from other participants.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it is true that COVID has, because people have been locked down and forced to stay at home, created a new kind of interest and appreciation of the public space, public realm, whether it's parks, whether it's open space. Just walking in the street became a treat, and I think it's been very interesting to observe, certainly in kind of my neighborhood, how that new interest in being public and being able to use the public space has created a kind of a different kind of contestation of who can use it and how and doing what. So I think that is something that is COVID has definitely brought up a renewed kind of focus on public space. And as I think all of you have said, it has brought up a new kind of focus on the public imagination, in the sense that in the townships, people were locked down through the army. You saw the army moving in, you saw people being treated quite horrendously and being made to exercise, and yet none of that kind of draconian actions of lockdown were carried out in the suburbs. Now, why is that? These are different parts of the city, but it's the same city. So it similarly raises questions about the imaginary. Maybe we can address some of the questions that are in the chat
I
group.
would love to give you some of the questions, but Khalid had a comment. So do you quickly want to give your comment, Khalid, before you're on mute again?
Sorry, thank you. I muted myself. So, Betty, I was in fact having the same thought as you, is that there's been the only action that we've seen in terms of COVID response or response to COVID has been the contestation of space. And on the one hand, certainly in my experience, is the informal contestation. So we've seen lots of protests from areas like Kailicha and the like. But we've also, interestingly enough, seen contestation of the public space from people who want to use our beaches. And we can recall some interesting images emerging out of places like Muizenberg, where the surfers were proclaiming their right to access, the public realm in that case. So certainly we've done protesting well, I think, in terms of claiming space, but there's been no lasting implications of it. I haven't seen tangible translation into making space as opposed to claiming space.
Okay,
and
thanks.
I think some of the questions really speak to what can we do, and it speaks to education, both education for professionals, but education for the public. And I'm trying to group a few comments together as I give them to you. And I want to start with Karuni Naidu's first one, who says, Khalid, you're doing great work, and I appreciate your approach. Informal settlements are mainstream, not marginal. So basically saying that those are the people that we need to be working for. And then I see recently Lillian Lenard said we need to listen and react to what the common person has to say of their conditions of living. Abdurazak said, during the initial phases of lockdown, I noticed many big and beautiful buildings and spaces like mosques, churches, etc. standing dormant. How do we get to use these buildings as spaces for shelter, medical facilities, learning, etc. during a crisis or natural disaster, and maybe outside of this time as well? Instead of setting up costly facilities like we saw in Strandfontein, that was an absolute waste. And then Nadine Hutting and Johan Kutze and Andrea du Plessis had more or less the same sentiment. They said, or Nadine actually says, I'm probably not going to be very popular raising this point, but we are focusing on how we as the professionals can change the environment. But this cannot be successful without social behavioral change. And with a rapid growing population and increasing unemployment, it puts even more pressure on the professionals to find solutions and on our limited amount of resources. Without the support of our government and the communities, which I know we mostly have, our hands are tied. So that speaks to education outside of academia, but then interesting, one of the participants said, Gillian Marsland says, we go to CPD courses on fenestration or power preservation, and then this discussion on informal settlements, and there's such a huge disjunction. So it's also our own education. And somewhere Krishna had a comment, Krishna du Plessis, that said there's so much research being done in all the universities, and how do we get to share this, and what kind of space can we do this in? There were a few other comments, but I'm going to leave that at that, and maybe you can react to that.
Can I say something about the professionals finding solutions?
Yes, go ahead.
So I think that we're putting too much emphasis on us, the professionals. I think the solutions need to come from the collective, and I think that that's what we've done for too long. Is we haven't actually understood the multiple discussions on the table. So that's just my first point. Khalid, just to raise from your perspective, there's a representative in Gugulethu who's actually going around putting white dots outside ShopRite and doing some amazing things to try and encourage social distancing from a very local perspective. But you know, his role on the ground is really complicated and complex. But we're not really understanding kind of those complexities of what actually are happening on the ground, partly because most of us are also in lockdown. So how do we gather this information? And that goes to my last point around linking research, which I think is the most amazing production of and library, and the idea of a wiki for South Africa of patterns and processes is very exciting, and landing as off-grid, so something you're not going to find on a GIS either. So just from my side, thanks.
Thank you. Solam, do you have any comments?
Yes, I'm trying to unmute myself. Yeah, just I think to try and pretend that the city is not experiencing problems is farcical. You know, and I'll use the example of the nonsense and the shenanigans that are going across the pond, you know, in Trump country. But we need a social agenda. You know, I think there has to be a social agenda through the COVID and through, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, through the Me Too movement. There seems to be an awareness into investing in the person and having humility, I guess what we would call here Ubuntu. So we need to bring back the principles of Ubuntu. And if we don't start factoring those principles in how we make the cities, we may as well start working for Trump.
Thank you. I mean, the big question really for practitioners would be, are the building blocks of what we use changing? What has changed in the discipline in terms of how we map, how we research, how we understand urbanity, and how we design for it? For example, Khalid, you mentioned the kind of often mentioned idea that this urban trajectory is going to happen, and that more and more people are becoming urban, and we're going to have to design for that. But maybe there's a different trajectory now post-COVID, where that kind of assumption of a continuous urbanity might be being turned on its head. I don't know, with unemployment and people going back to the land. Maybe there's a different, there are different models that we need to look at. There are different building blocks of what the future of a city could look like.
I think you're onto something there, Betty, and this idea of having a nimble city that kind of isn't only about the fixes, but the in between. You know, the ability for people to not only identify themselves in public space, but to be able to shift. Not only physically shift, but shift identities and meanings of places. I think the potential for making cities that we belong in is kind of rooted in that. So the thing though that and thank you for whoever made that lovely comment about enjoying the work that I do. I do need to clarify though, because I'm not 100%, how to put this politically correct. Bottom-up planning for me has limitations, and the limitations, or the role of an architect in that kind of context, as seen by bottom-up thinkers, is that we are facilitators to a process. And I'm more in the camp that suggests that I get engaged from the bottom up, but that my role in that kind of context is to bring my experience and my shall we specific knowledge on a subject to bear in a process, and that implies being active participants in a design process, and not only a facilitator to the process. And that can be contentious in many ways, but I've practically been in too many processes that was entirely clean bottom up that resulted in no outcomes. The process of negotiating broadly about what is appropriate and what's not appropriate is fraught with challenges, and Salam kind of talks about the political challenges, presuming political up in terms of governance, but the political challenges are also within communities to negotiate what is something that's appropriate. We've found to be equally challenging, and the role of designers in these kind of contexts is to often lead the conversations, and it's sometimes a misnomer to imagine that an architect doesn't influence a design process as the facilitator. So the driver for action and the driver for consequence for a design process remains our responsibility to execute. And of course, the implication is that we need to find ways to be inclusive and participatory and doing all the things that will make the action a collective action. But producing documents that sit on shelves should also be a thing of the past, along with master planning. So I certainly advocate for planning that is active and participatory, that's results driven and results in terms of execution of projects. And I'm sure Katie and the like will tell you of all the frustrations that communities experience when there's no action, right? Or action takes too long to materialize. And this juggling through bureaucracy and the bureaucratic systems and processes to make things happen is equally stifling. So what I advocate clearly is that there are many actors in the city, and all of the actors, whether it be government, private sector, or the layman, all needs to buy into a vision, as Salam mentions, but more likely it is about an emergence of a vision. So through collective action, over time, there's an emergence of something that we all share, or our produce, or our cultural product, our cultural landscape is something that we made collectively, and what emerges represents us. So there's a bit of shall we say nuance in certainly where I believe we should be acting and how we should be acting in making our cities.
Thank you. I think we're coming close to the end. Is that right?
Yes,
I know we could
have
go
a
on
minute or two left. So maybe if there's some concluding comments, and then there will be some thank yous at the end.
Okay, thank you. As you can imagine, this topic kind of cuts across both what we do as practitioners, how we experience our cities as inhabitants, and our hopes and visions for the future. And I think possibly it's too early, but out of this will probably become a reevaluation of some of the things we take for granted as urban practitioners. You know, there's discussions around densities, what are good densities, discussions around polycentric cities, or whether cities need to become balkanized into kind of different hamlets that you can lock one down and open one up if there's a pandemic, issues about the kind of distancing and distances that we have to travel in our daily lives, questions about zoning, re-questioning, and kind of city bylaws. How do we imagine public space and how we can use and not use them? And as Khalid has said, the kind of bureaucracy that comes with planning and urban design, whether these bureaucracies can be short-circuited because we are dealing with such, such crises. And I think for me, I think people in government are probably listening now more than before because they've experienced a kind of a need to actually rethink a lot of these issues. And I think it would be a pity if we, in whatever forum, miss the opportunity to speak to an audience that is probably listening now more than ever before. So I would leave my comments on that for everybody, and hand it over to you, Herm, if you want to have other comments or questions, or any of the participants, in fact. Sorry.
There was just one thing I wanted to address.
Yes.
Can I go? Or?
Yes, please.
I think maybe there was a miscommunication or a misunderstanding when I talk about the political agenda. It's not a binary of top, down, bottom up, or like the state versus the people. For example, we've done work, to give an example, in let's say in Alexandra, and then you have a meeting with the community. Who is the community? The community is made up of very many political organizations themselves. So we mitigate these. We have to mitigate between, who is in the ruling power, as we can see now, what's currently happening. There are many factions within the state in itself. But, when you go down onto the streets as well, who are you representing? So it's just having nuances. Coming back then to the departure point of Ubuntu, having a social agenda, which is about empowering the human being, regardless of race, color, creed, religion, etc., etc. That's it for me. Thank you, Betty.
Thank you. Catherine or Khalid, do you want last comments before we get into trouble?
I think I've said enough.
Thank you.
I like the frames, Catherine.
Good.
Okay, Hermie, back to you.
Yes, I see Lone. I'm sure that you unvideoed yourself because you want to say something.
No. I mean, just great conversation. And I think, as I just said in there, thank you to all of you. But also, it seems like this is a conversation that needs much, much, much more airtime. And I just want to say, I mean, it's fantastic that we can talk across the country in this kind of format and get views from everywhere, because although each city is different, each area is different, and so on, I think, some of the ideas do cross-cut anywhere that you are. So just, thank you for a great conversation.
Yes, it was an absolutely great conversation. We've run a little bit over time, but I think it's all okay. And before I thank everyone, I want to remind you of our next perspective next Wednesday. And that one will focus on how has COVID-19 impacted how we create responsive architecture. For that, our chair will be Kevin Bingham, Director of FGG Architects in Durban. And our participants are Dr. Luyanda Mpalwa of Design Space Africa, Fulson Dekler of 2610 South Architects, and Ankia Bormans of Terra Plus Landscape Architects. It promises to be just as exciting as today. I want to really thank Lone Paulson of OpenArchitecture for her guidance, conceptualizing this perspective series and advice on selection of the panelists. And a sincere thanks to Mpeti for chairing a great session and pulling it all together. Khalid for grounding us in history and reminding us that changes happen very quickly and it can happen with our designers, so we need to adjust. Catherine for giving us the framework of spaces for practice, exchange and learning, and Salam for asking us whose story we are listening to and asking us also to bring back the principles of Ubuntu. You were all engaging and entertaining and introduced us to new perspectives on city living and prompted us to reflect on our approach and attitudes towards our own work and lives. I also want to really thank all the behind the scenes people, Simon, Chelsea from STADIO, Yolanda representing the AFA, and Brent from CIFA for allocating the CPD. And I want to thank everybody in the audience. We were almost, I think at one stage, 230 in the room. And for the lively discussions on the side, thank you very much for attending. And I hope that we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.